I'm Mark Ventham.
And I'm Graham Nichols, and you're listening to Ordinary. And we've got one of those exciting weeks when we've got a special guest, and our guest today is Dan Strange. Welcome, Dan.
Hi guys, hi Graham, hi Ventham, good to see you. I call him Ventham because he used to be a student of mine, so
It's very public school, it's a particular subculture.
No, please, look at me, please don't ever accuse me of that, but there you go, yeah.
Sorry, sir.
Yeah. So Dan, you are here, just for people watching the video, why are you wearing so many clothes?
Well, we've all got COVID in our household, but also when the first person got COVID, because we've got loads of kids and mother-in-law and everything, all the building work that we're having done in this house had to go, including how do we turn on the heating system, which we've just got set in. So there's no heating, and no one can come to fix it until the last person is out of quarantine, which will be about 2025 at this rate. So it's cold, and I'm recovering from COVID, but I'm delighted to be with you. Right. And there you go.
Yeah, that'll teach you to have so many children.
Thank you.
Yeah. So tell us about yourself. So you've got a wife and some children by all accounts, and a mother-in-law as well. I'm
married to Ellie. We've got 7 kids. 4 of them are living with us still. I have been for 16 years. I was the director of Oak Hill Theological College, and I've currently and now moved to a new position as the director of a new thing called Crosslands Forum, which is a centre for cultural engagement and mission as part of Crosslands training. And we've moved from North London up to Gateshead, so that's where I'm speaking to you from now. Right. We're attending Hope Community Church, hoping to get stuck in there, little FIC church in Gateshead. So that's
nice. So, is there a cultural difference between Gateshead and North London where you lived?
Yes. The temperature would be the first, but yeah, we're getting used to a northeast way of life. And do you know what? Amazingly, everything doesn't revolve around London. Right. Which is we're getting used to that, but it's great. We're getting stuck in, and some of the cliches and the stereotypes are true. People do seem genuinely a bit more open and friendly around here, which is great. We're enjoying it.
North London.
Not in North London.
Wow.
So yeah.
So we're talking about culture today, and we have 2 boys from Essex, born in Southend, talking about culture. I think there's an irony in there somewhere.
Yes. As I say, though, that culture has been defined in many ways, but one definition is this idea of, culture as civilization. And I think where we come from, mate, it was never seen as being cultured, innit? So
the thing is, though, even I know you're sort of parodying yourself because you're both kind of intellectuals who.
I've never been called that before, and Dan definitely knows that's not true because he's read my essays.
I was doing it to try and include you, Mark. But anyway,
okay.
But you're reasonable professional education and sort of have the cultural tools to even ridicule your sort of Essex background. But even if you're in Essex and you don't have those sort of all those categories to use, you're still in a culture, aren't you, Dan?
Yes, I mean we are cultural beings. I know as Christians we sometimes like to think that we're transcultural or that culture is just out there, but everything that we do, I mean, it's a denial of our creaturehood if we think that we are cultureless. And then the question is, how are we consciously engaged with the culture that we're in critically, and that's the important thing.
So quick sort of pocketbook definitions then. So what is culture, and then why is cultural engagement a thing worth talking about? Give us those 2 things.
Yeah, so I would say culture is our kind of, from a theological point of view, you could call it a lived worldview. So the roots of that we're made in God's image, we're made to worship. That will be the worship of God or the worship of idols, and those roots have fruit, and the fruit is how we live our lives, the things that we do. So I've got a very kind of expansive definition of what culture is. It includes everything. But one writer talks about culture being our religion externalized, which I think is a very helpful way of doing it, of understanding it. We become what we worship, says the Psalm. And also linked to that is this command that God gives in Genesis, that we should go and fill and subdue the earth, have dominion. And that's the theologians have called that the cultural mandate. And I think that is something should take very seriously. Of course, if we're doing that under God's norms, that's great. If we're not doing it under God's norms, that's when there's a problem. But we don't stop being cultural beings. We want to make a home for ourselves, and then we offer people that home. And when people agree that this is the kind of home we should be building, I suppose you call that a culture.
Yeah.
And that's why there's so many of them.
Yeah. So is it a new thing to talk about culture? It's obviously not a new thing to talk about the world in which we live and the values and the idolatry or the cultural mandate. Those are not new terms. But is the idea of culture and cultural engagement relatively new, the last 20, 30 years or something?
I mean, what do you mean for Christians to think about it?
Yes, to Christians to use those terms.
Yeah, I mean, I think since the beginning, Christians have always had to struggle with what does it mean to be in the world but not of the world. I mean, that can be a platitude that you say, but actually when you work it out, and I think some of the great Christian minds, going through history, Augustine and others, the reformers, they were always trying to work out how does one live faithfully? What's the relationship between, the Christian life and everything else out there? And so I think it's a perennial issue. I do think in the last, 20 or 30 years, I hope as evangelicals we've been thinking about it a little bit more critically, especially as all kinds of other ways of being kind of put pressure on the church to think about how are we going to engage. And so, in some of the books I've written, I make this thing about some churches just kind of in their reaction to culture, they just want to look in. They're, holding hands, singing Kumbaya, waiting for Jesus to come again. They're kind of, there's no engagement. There's the lashing out engagement, and there's just the looking like it's so difficult being countercultural. We might as well just do what everyone else is doing. And I don't think they're great gospel responses to how we should be engaging culture.
Why is it that we've shifted over the last 20 years to think more about it? As in, like Augustine was thinking about it, hundreds of years ago. Why is there suddenly a shift that we suddenly started going, actually, no, we as a church need to engage far more with the culture in a thoughtful, biblical way? Like, why?
Yeah, but
why the shift in 20 years?
I think. Well, I mean, maybe 20 years is a bit of an arbitrary point. I think that increasingly, if we didn't think that cultural engagement was important, the fact is that as we become more and more de-Christianized, there's more and more pressure for us to think, hey, we can't take for granted all the things that we maybe did take for granted a long time ago. And we've been living off this borrowed capital of a Christian worldview. And now all of a sudden, maybe some of us have woken up and thought, hey, it wasn't, maybe these things aren't there just because they've always been there. Maybe this is part of what it means for Christianity, the Christian faith, to shape a culture, and that there are lots of other ways of being that aren't like that. And so we need to think about this more. I mean, obviously the whole issue of, like, I don't know, this whole thing about evangelism versus social involvement, I mean, that's been a long running thing, like a dog with a bone. We kind of discuss it in every generation, and there's been ups and downs. But I do think there's a recognition in our context, especially as we become more and more post-Christian in that sense. How are we to engage with the world around us for the sake of God's glory, for our discipleship, for our evangelism? And I think that's prompted a lot of issues. I mean, there are particular people associated with that. I mean, I do think that Tim Keller has had a big influence on us thinking, asking missiological questions about mission, not just to what we might say has been out there cross-cultural mission, but how does that apply to a situation around us which is changing massively and very quickly, and that's disorientating.
And I guess I think you did say, but just to kind of expand on it a little bit, I guess just the fact that the cultural values and the cultural practices and the kind of entertainments that are all around us are more questioning or challenging our Christian faith and values, probably more than they were for, I don't know, my parents' generation. So although my parents didn't live in a particularly Christian country more than I did, the sort of values around and the general cultural assumptions were not making them think sort of really hard because they weren't really that challenging. There was romantic kissing on the films they were watching, and that was it. And they weren't sort of having loads of swearing in the books they were reading and the songs they were listening to. And they weren't having loads of challenges at work to do with, sexuality or identity or something else. So, I think I'm wary of a kind of what you might call it's a straight line kind of, down to hell kind of thing in the sense of all
cultures, I think, have bits that you want to praise and bits that you want to kind of question. And so we need to be careful, especially, I suppose, what you might call a kind of a sentimentality, where we're kind of thinking, oh, wasn't it better in the old days? And I think we need to be really careful of that. On the other hand, I don't think you can deny that the influence that the Christian faith has had on the cultural artery of our Western context has been significant, and that there's a shifting there. But I mean, there's a point I make, in William Wilberforce, in one of his books in 1797, was saying how people want Christian morality. What they don't want is what he calls the peculiar doctrines of Christianity. So, belief in the Bible has been the word of God, belief in the atonement, belief in judgment. So if Wilberforce was saying that then, and he makes the point that you can't have morality without the gospel. And so in our context, 300, 400 years later, you can see how that's even more the case now.
Sure. It was more to it was more to explain rather than say it was particularly a better era, but to explain maybe why our interest. Did you have another question, Mark, to go for?
I didn't, but I'm sure we can think of one.
While you're thinking of one, do you want to give some practical examples or principles before we go practical of cultural engagement? We are going to mention your couple of more recent books, but we'll get to that sort of nearer the end. But in your writings, I think you talk about some principles of cultural engagement that involve sort of, stepping into it, but in critiquing, but, affirming, all those sort of things.
Yeah. So the big model that I kind of try to develop is this idea of subversive fulfillment, which basically says that the gospel of Jesus Christ, preaching Christ crucified, the message of Christ crucified, always confronts every culture, including our own, and always connects at the same time. And I make quite a big store of 1 Corinthians 1 here, where the message of the cross is foolishness, and so there's the sense in which whatever any culture thinks are their hopes, dreams, aspirations will always be challenged by Christ crucified. It's the opposite. What we think is wise, God thinks is foolish, and vice versa. So the cross is always a kind of a big fat no to any world's aspirations. But the gospel also connects, because Paul in that passage in 1 Corinthians 1 makes the distinction between two ethnic groups, Jews and Greeks, and they have their own particular ways of viewing the world, hopes, dreams, fears. Jews look for power, Greeks look for wisdom. And in that passage in 1 Corinthians, Paul doesn't say we preach Christ crucified and it doesn't really matter what any other culture thinks. So you can it doesn't matter what you think. I'm just going to preach Christ crucified in quite a flat way. At the end, he says Christ is the power of God. He is the wisdom of God, but just in the opposite way that Jews and Greeks expect. But he still makes the connection. So I think the point of subversive fulfillment is that the gospel both subverts every way of viewing the world, but it also fulfills it. And I think some evangelicals, some Christians are great at the confrontation and some are great at the connection, and we need to do both. And I think that's what we see modelled most clearly in Acts 17, where Paul is, he's distressed by the idolatry that he sees. He calls to people to repent, but he wanders around their people's objects of worship. He says, look, you're worshipping in completely the wrong way. And what I'm going to say really has nothing to do with what you're worshipping has nothing to do with Jesus Christ in a certain sense, but he's got to start somewhere. And so he kind of subverts and then he fulfills to get to Christ. And so my work has been trying to say, how do we do that? How do we both confront and connect at the same time? How is the gospel both an appeal, turn around, repent, come to Christ, and it's also appealing, though, because people are running to God and running away from God at the same time?
And how do we begin to connect that, like, just for the ordinary believer in the everyday life? So I can begin to see how I might do that as a preacher or as a church, but how do I do that as just an ordinary believer in the everyday?
I think,
where do I connect that out?
Yeah, I think in everything that we do and say, it's the recognition that every human being that we talk to is a religious human being who has a relationship with God, who knows God, Romans 1, and doesn't know God, Acts 17, who is running to and running away. And I suppose that's the encouragement that what I'm trying to do in my writing is to say there's not this huge disconnect between talking about your faith or applying your faith, all this analysis to our own hearts, and where people are at. And the issue that I have, or the thing that I think we're worried about, is that we just can't get traction with people. People aren't interested. You have to do gear crunches to be able to talk about things of faith. People are just living their lives. They're not interested in what we have to say. But theologically speaking, when we look at them through the lens of Scripture, they are religious people. We may have to dig deep to find out, but we all worship, we all have desires, we're all made, because we're all made in God's image. And so my work is trying to say, have confidence that, you're going to have to do some hard work here, because we're in this situation that might seem so secular, but actually all human beings are religious, and you're only a little bit away from being able to talk about really important, significant things that then you might have an opportunity to say something about your faith, because everyone has faith at that point.
Would that be then, in that sense, the more I understand the nature of humanity, as in how I understand who I am, made in the image of God, how I understand actually the fall, how that impacts, touches on what I'm called to do, the clearer I am on that, the easier it's going to be to connect to others, because I'm going to begin to see that actually we are worshipping beings. I am made in the image. I am fallen. Easier
in the sense of the practicalities of trying to make the connections, but easier, I think, in our own kind of I don't know, not enthusiasm, but our own kind of we're not going to be, I would say, hopefully we're not going to be so downhearted or dispirited or frustrated, because yes, we're going to have to, because we need to say, and that's living by faith, this person who shows no interest in anything to do with the gospel, actually the Bible tells me they do know God. They are running to him and running away from him, and there's always a way in. If there's not a way in, then they're not human. And yes, of course, every society has different, people are more hardened than others, I suppose you could say. But I think it's always that we need to be praying that they are expressing their religiosity, not in conventional ways, and that's the important thing, but in all kinds of ways, in the fact that they do have hopes, dreams, desires, hopes and fears.
Yeah.
In that sense that, we are believers, so there is a difference, but actually we're more alike than we are unalike.
Yeah, they're believers as well. Yeah, they're believers as well. And again, what I'm trying to work out is that some of the big theological questions that we have, unbelievers live those theological questions as well. They're struggling with the same issues.
Yeah, although they may not,
just working them out in different
not be
ways.
articulating them though.
No, and that's the thing. In Isaiah, in that passage in Isaiah where the idolater kind of makes their dinner and then they use the fuel to worship, and Isaiah says this is ridiculous. The key line there is Isaiah says no one stops to think, and so people the fact that we're having this conversation is not normal in that sense, because people aren't thinking, they're living their lives. But I think our job as Christians is to get people to stop and think, do you know what you're doing? And that's what that kind of that model that I try to bring out in terms of entering into a worldview, exploring it, exposing it, evangelizing, is important. And crucial to all of that is really, again, not just doing that, not just seeing other people like that, but doing that in our own hearts as well, because of the end of 1 John, beloved, keep yourselves from idols. We have to do this analysis for ourselves, because we know that our hearts are prone to wander, and so we need to be constantly drawn back to, what does the Bible say about this? How is this making me? How can this make me more like Christ?
I love
part of the. Go on.
Go on. No, you go, Mark.
Well, no, I was just thinking part of the danger with the idols, particularly that Isaiah, is that you end up becoming what you worship.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So your idol is not, because we think of idols, and rightly the Bible mocks them. Obviously Isaiah, Jeremiah, the same. But in terms of that sense of you end up becoming what you worship, which is what you see the world comes, isn't it?
Yes.
In how it's reflecting what it loves, it's become. And actually, the danger for me as a believer, don't keep yourself from idols, because you are what you worship at the end of the day. That is the reality, which then helps me as I engage with them, because I'm seeing what they worship as I look at them, as I observe.
And that's why when we live in a society where there's so many different cultures, and behind those cultures are different ways of worship, why we can't agree on anything. If you live in a society where everyone believes the same thing, they all worship the same God, then that models back, everyone agrees about how we should live our lives. We live in a situation where there's so many different worldviews, so many different ways of viewing the world, that of course when no one agrees, and then what does a government do when no one agrees? They have to legislate. So that explains why everything has to be legalized, because you have to get things done, because no one is going to do things by consensus, because the way that, for example, Muslims would want to organize themselves is different from the way that other people would want to, secular people. So that's the kind of the situation that we find ourselves in at the moment. The public square becomes, as one writer says, kind of a battleground for the gods, because we're always fighting for our ultimate objects of worship.
I love the idea of gear crunches. I like that analogy. And I was talking to my community group this week. I happened to have preached last week on the greatest sign is the sign of Jonah, says Jesus, and it's going to be his death and resurrection. And I was just getting them to brainstorm, okay, what themes are shown at the cross? And when they eventually got into it, they thought, creation, new creation, just death, what it is to be human, sin, God's wrath, God's judgment, God's love, the relationship between the Father. Basically every Christian doctrine, and pretty much every question that people would ask, because here's a bloke dying, here's the injustice, anyway, so they were getting quite enthusiastic about it, and then I said, this would be an easy conversation to have with your mates, wouldn't it? And they're all going, no. But they got enthusiastic about the idea that you could connect with people, but the gear crunch is, I'm talking about the football, or I'm talking about Netflix series I'm watching, or about isn't COVID terrible, and it's finding the gear change that isn't a crunch. So help us out with that.
Yeah. So this does. I know you're resisting me getting on to talking about this book, but this is what this book Magnetic's about, because there's a writer who I've been very influenced by, a guy called J.H. Bavinck, who was a missionary in Indonesia in the 50s and 60s, and he kind of posits this idea that coming out of understanding Romans 1 and Acts 17, all the things that we've spoken about, that actually all human beings, there are these 5 what he calls magnetic points, things that we're all human beings are drawn to, kind of questions or issues that we have to deal with. And what I'm trying to do in this book is to say that Bavinck was working in a very kind of a context where it was Muslims and Hindus, like more established religions, however you want to define that. What I'm trying to do is to say, how do these categories still relate and work in our post-Christian kind of secular context? But those 5 areas, I think, are they're all connected, but they're like big buckets of categories that I think when you start looking at them and you see the world through these things, then people are answering these issues all the time. So there's this issue of totality, how do we connect? The issue of norms, how do I decide what's right and wrong, and how do we set those values? The issue of deliverance, the fact that the world is a mess, and how do we solve it? The issue of destiny. Do I lead my life or do I undergo my life? Am I a victim? Do I have any say in my life? And then this bigger question of a higher power. Is there a transcendent, something beyond? And so in the book, I explain all of these things and then give examples in contemporary culture as to how we might see these. And then I think hopefully people then start getting a framework to then say, wow, this person who shows no interest in anything, actually, though, they're manifesting these points all the time. And that's true, because that's what the Bible says about them.
So that's the book Magnetic.
Yes, Making Faith Magnetic, yeah.
Making Faith Magnetic, and that's very recently out, isn't it?
That's out. That was out at the beginning of this month,
Yeah. And that would be ideal for Christians who are kind of more at the how-to level rather than cultural analysis. It's more of the...
Well, yeah, kind of. Although, there's 2 books. One's this Making Faith Magnetic book is a bit of a sequel to the...
I've got this
Plugged In book. There you go. Yeah. So you need to read the sequel. So yeah, Plugged In was about why we should engage culture, and this idea of subversive fulfillment, and it looks at Acts 17, and it gives some examples of how we might understand, like, go about and do some cultural analysis for the sake of evangelism, discipleship, all the things I've been talking about. This actually gives a bit more of a framework, because it doesn't just leave you hanging by saying go and do it. It just says here is a framework that you could use. And my dream for the book is that people in churches all across the country would get together, read the material, and say, hey, we're going to apply this to not only to our individual lives, but also to our church. What might this mean for our church in the locality? So I did this with a church in Newcastle the other weekend, and you can get very specific. This is the culture around us. It's not meant to be left at 30,000 feet. It's saying, how does this stuff apply? And there's some really interesting stuff about the church that I'd love you to ask me about, because I think the other thing is that we're not to do this as individuals, that we're meant to do this as communities, working it through together. And I hope this is a guide or a stimulus for us to be starting to doing this analysis and this engagement at a very detailed level in a local context.
Yeah. Mark wants to ask you about the church.
Well, I was just wondering, how does it work out in a church and that connect? How do you do that? That'd be great.
Yeah. Well, I think it's saying this could be a framework in these areas that we could get together as believers in a particular locality and say, okay, how do people that we know and that the church knows, or the area that we're in, how do they manifest these particular issues? And then how might that shape our ministry, not just as individual Christians, but as a church, kind of a local church as well. I think the other thing, and this is the thing that I'd be interested to talk to you guys about, is in the book, Jesus is the answer. Jesus is the answer to these magnetic points. Obviously, he's the way that we connect. He's the norm. He's the way of deliverance. He helps us understand this issue of responsibility and sovereignty. He is the higher power. So Jesus is the answer. But I think one of the key things I'm wanting to get across is the way that we see that in our lives is not just at a kind of pietistical, my own relationship with Jesus, although that's really important. It's not just about communion with God. It's about how do we see these things answered in our community as local Christians? How does the church model this? And it's interesting, as I've been doing this in churches up and down the country, sometimes there's a reticence to give the church as being the way that we see this most clearly. Yeah. Why would you want to point to the church? Because the church is messy. There's all kinds of difficulties. The church, and so I think I want to continue to kind of proclaim that actually the closest thing that we have to how some of these things are seen tangibly, how these magnetic points are seen, how do we see what connection really looks like? How do we understand a place where there's people can be themselves, but also are called to radical discipleship? How do we see how, all of these things, how does the church at a very local level answer that? If you don't do that, it just becomes kind of like quite abstract. But again, people don't seem to want to give the church as being the answer. And that I find that troubling.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is, though?
Because I think people I think people forget what the church is. We're embarrassed by it because do we want to invite people to our church and the rest of the Christians around that I know? I just think it's that tension that we live with, that the church is this amazing restoration project, the closest thing we have to the new heaven and new earth now. But we like to keep it at arm's length, but it has to be the answer. Church has to be the way that we show unity. Yeah. And I think that's what we have to, that's a longer work, isn't it?
Yeah, I think, just to give you a sort of read on that, I think we just at Christchurch Overseas have just probably in a bit of a track where we're quite a strong emphasis on the church, particularly because of coming out of COVID and having to kind of rethink what is church about. If some are disparate and some are meeting physically and all that kind of things made us think about that. So we've done a couple of evening sessions, which are more seminar style with discussion about what is the church and kind of enthusing about that. Some of the sermon topics coming up happen to be aligned with that. We got one on church culture coming up soon. And I think I'm not sure we're very good at the practice of it, but I think in the principle, I think I'm sure Mark would agree, we're totally convinced about the value of the church, and we're totally convinced that we're all struggling a bit to give it enough value because of our individual materialism and our individual pietism and our individual family lives and so forth. And so So the idea that this is your family, and this is in a sense your primary family, is quite alien to Christian culture, let alone to other culture.
Yeah.
And we're trying to push against that, but without being too self-righteous, because we're struggling with the same things ourselves.
Yeah. But it is this idea of how do we engage, or how do we support each other? We've got to collaborate and do it together.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing, can I make one more point? The other thing that's been the kind of the penny dropping for me is, it's interesting. The Good Book Company, who I love, who's published the book, they wanted me to focus the book on, which it is kind of about evangelism and apologetics, but actually, I would like the book to be as much about discipleship. That is to say, don't think about evangelism or witness as being a kind of a compartment of your life in like a pie chart. As someone said to me, think of it as a flow diagram. So as I apply this analysis to my own heart, and I fall in love more with Jesus because I know he is the one who answers all of these points, then naturally that will give me opportunity to be able to want to speak about him. So I just worry sometimes that if we think that evangelism is a thing that we have to do, rather than saying we're disciples called to follow Jesus, who is the way, of truth, and the life, and we follow him along the way. As we do that, as we help each other do that, as you as pastors encourage and lead your people to apply that discipleship to themselves, then I think that will naturally be evangelistic. If we don't do that, then we're thinking, I need to do evangelism on a Wednesday, and this is a project. It's not like that. It's much more organic. And so as we apply the magnetic points to ourselves and we see how Jesus is the answer, we will then become magnetized. That's the point at the end of the book. How do we become a magnetic people? We become a magnetic people by sticking to Christ, and we need to do that together. And that's why the church is important. That's why the means of grace are important, because every week your people come in from their vocations, they're beaten up, they need to be fed, they need to be bandaged up. That's your job. That's your job as pastors. I hope, Mark, that's what I was teaching you at college, that's what you're to do. And then you have a particular role then in building up the people and then pushing them out back into the world to be salt and light in the world. And to do that, that's why the means of grace, that's why preaching, that's why Lord's Supper, that's why discipline is so important, so that there is this kind of, I liken the church to like an army medical tent where people are coming in and then they need to be pushed out again. And that's why the church is so central to this cultural engagement piece.
But presumably the church is also not just, there is a sense where I think you said earlier, in terms of people coming into the church and seeing what's happening, isn't it? Jonathan Leeman talks about like the kingdom outposts. There is a sense where we are taste of what the kingdom of God should be right here, right now. And unless you're seeing that, unless you're grasping that, you're kind of missing out on what actually church is really all about as well. Because otherwise it becomes therapeutic. I just come, I get a little bit of therapy on a Sunday morning, and I go. We want to equip, bandage up, do all of those. But there is something even greater going on as well when we gather. Here's Christ. So it's the if you have the idea of like the gathered church and scattered church, of course, ecclesia is the gathering. I think the illustrations that we use are important. For years, I was using this illustration of the church is like a show home in a building site. When you go to a show home and everything's been built, but actually we're not really a show home. It's rather we're this kind of restoration project that has things falling off, but you can see what it was and what it will be, and that's the big thing. I think having the right expectations at that point is important. But the church being the bullseye of what God is doing in the world is crucial, and there is something very central about that gathering that needs to be recognised. Because that excites then, doesn't it? Because actually then I'm not just turning up because I want to catch up with my mates. Yes, that's a great thing because we're a community, we're a family, but actually I'm beginning to see that actually God's purpose for where we are, Haywards Heath, is actually going to be through this local church that he has brought about, restoring and using to further Christ as we become magnetic and as both as a church but as individuals where God has placed us. So in some of these discussions it's always a bit confusing, isn't it? Because I do think there's a distinction to be made between church as church and church as Christians. So I think there is an institutional, and that's where the gathering is so important, but then of course there's the scattering as well, so it's both need to be emphasised. That's helpful.
We are nearly out of time because we try and keep these to about half an hour. So, final plug. So, this is the book you should read first.
I think so.
I enjoyed that. The bird watching chapter, I was going to ask you about that, but we run out of time, so you'll have to watch it yourself.
Oh, well.
And I love the principles on what you watch, because sometimes it can be too sort of black and white about what you watch and how you discern, so that's really helpful. Your other book, which you held up already, you can hold it up again.
Yeah. So this is Making Faith Magnetic. So this is taking this framework and saying, how do we apply this to our culture at the moment, these magnetic points? And I think there's real traction with this. And again, I'd love to see Christians take it and then start doing it themselves in their own local context.
We might do it.
And what will be the third book, Dan? Because all good have trilogies, we know that. So there's got to be a third coming out
I don't
in
know.
a year's time.
At the moment, I don't know what it will be. I mean, I'm quite interested in taking both of these and making it into a course that churches could do together, like a framework for reading them, where then people... And that's the thing, as in my conversations... where churches have started doing it, the idea of meeting together to discuss and not having all the answers and not saying this is the answer, but getting everyone in your church to be discussing their lives, that can't be a bad thing. That's got to be a good thing. Yeah, and maybe definitely. this just gives these books just give a little bit of scaffold for how you might do that.
Maybe something about the new heavens, new earth, and death and stuff like that, which engaging with all that stuff, but in a sort of it's just an idea and just popped in my head because I thought this is very here and now. These two books, and I was thinking about the values of the kind of age to come and how they impact. Not so much describing the age to come, but what the impact is. Anyway, that's my idea, and I've sold it to you for nothing.
I'll take that to the Good Book Company immediately.
All right, it's been really good to have you on.
No, great guys, really good.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
For anyone listening, we recommend both of those books heartily. And maybe in our church we'll do it. But yeah, if you get that course together in the next few weeks, that'd be really helpful. Save us having to do it.
We'll do it off in January.
Well, no, I mean, Mark's one of my kind of products in some way, so he can just go and do it. He knows how to do it. He was a very good student. He was an excellent student.
He was an intellectual just now.
Kind of you, Dan.
He was an intellectual just now, but now he's just a product.
Just
like a sausage or something.
I'm happy with that.
Always good banter, which I appreciate and always appreciate. So there you go.
We like a bit of banter.
All right.
Yeah.
God bless, guys.
Yeah. Cheers, guys.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Ordinary. We hope you enjoyed it. To keep up to date with future episodes, hit subscribe now.